Good afternoon. Thank you. Yeah, I've spent the past 25 years of my career specializing in intellectual property, and at Stratford, we help small and medium companies with their intellectual property strategy. But before working in this field, I had the privilege to work at Newbridge Networks, and I have several ex-colleagues here in the room. Yes, I am from the frame relay and ATM area, and some of you might not even know the acronym. I remember one of my last projects at Newbridge was working on a 100 megabit per second interface. At the time, we were struggling because the hardware could barely keep up with the throughput of packets coming in. So we had to design queuing systems to try to hold up the packets before the processors could handle them. And we called that a high-speed interface at the time. At the ATM Forum, we created a working group for video on demand, and everybody was scratching their heads wondering who would need video on demand since we have corner stores, renting DVDs, and that's just fine. So if you fast forward now 20 years, there's no corner stores selling DVDs. We all have Netflix and Apple TVs. I think what happened in the last 20 years is that a lot of the hardware became a commodity and everything, the software took over. And because software is a lot more agile, we were able to create so much more innovation. So now we have 1 gigabit interfaces to our homes using old coax cables. We have HD streaming to our TVs, real-time syncing of devices. The innovation is continuously happening, and a lot of this has to do with software, and I think also a lot of this has to do with open source software. So today's panel is on open source software. It's everywhere, in data servers, Internet of Things, smart devices, wireless communication protocols, artificial intelligence, networking, autonomous vehicles, and so much more. It's everywhere. And it's not going away. It's just going to be more pervasive. "68% of organizations have increased their use of open source software. 59 are planning to continue growing the use of that type of software as opposed to their own software. 52% are using open source as part of their digital transformation. And the value of open source companies and the acquisitions is in the fields of billions of dollars. So it's a huge, huge technological area. So, but as the open source software proliferates, it's going to be, is it an enabler or a threat in the future as we get more and more of it? And this is the topic of this panel today. So please meet our first panelist, Daniel, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. Daniel Bernier. I work in a technology and strategy and architecture group at Bell Canada. We're focusing on the evolution toward our network, we say Bell 2025, over in the next few years. My main focus area is around cloud native transformation. I'm part of the telco user group. I'm also involved in data plane programming in P4 community, and in ITF on some standards regarding our network transformation and protocols we use for that transformation.
Thank you. Ian.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks, JC and Sengen, for inviting me to come. Ian Hood, Red Hat Chief Technologist for our telco business globally, and I'm very happy to be back at home in Ottawa. I now live in the US, but it's always nice to be home. But in terms of where Red Hat sits, it's kind of a very interesting place to be. We're kind of at the intersection of two universes, the open source community and the businesses that actually want to go use them, right? So it's a matter of being able to take advantage of these technologies. And my focus these days, since I work mostly with the providers, we had the discussion earlier this morning about 5G, and my sort of view is it's not about the 5G highway so much, it's about what we enable on top of it, that actually drives the business that we need to go do, and actually change the lives of our communities around us. That's really kind of where my focus is in solving those business problems across the world that I travel. Ian?
And to make my life easier, we have another Ian on the panel.
There's no challenge there, right?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ian Jolliffe. I lead engineering for our cloud products at a company called Wind River. Our office is just located across the parking lot here in Canada North. Wind River is an operating system and cloud native company as well. But we actually have our software running over 2 billion devices around the world. And we even have software running on the Mars rover on the planet Mars. So our software is everywhere. My personal journey has been really interesting with respect to open source. Spent most of my career working on proprietary products in the telecom space. About 6 or 7 years ago, I got involved with a project called OpenStack, mainly about network virtualization and virtualizing workloads in the telecom and enterprise space. And recently, about 18 months ago, I was part of launching a new project as part of the Open Infrastructure Foundation called Starling X, really an edge-focused stack for virtualization and containerization of networking workloads, but also in the industrial space. So I'm on the TSC, the Technical Steering Committee for Starling X, and very active in open source now, and really happy to be here. Thanks, Senjen, for hosting an excellent event this afternoon and today, and looking forward to talking more with the fellow panelists here. And is OpenStack an enabler or a threat? Hell yes, it's actually both, so looking forward to it.
Thank you. So I guess our first question is, how does the use of open source software impact innovation? Some people will think that it's an enabler for innovation, but others will think that software developers have the tendency of reusing what exists already instead of trying to find a new solution or something new. So,
Personally, I think it's a good thing to the level that you have the breadth of community of engineers or software developers that actually create some things which are available to be reused. I think everybody would like to be able to have its own secret sauce. The trick is, do you have to do 25% of the secret sauce or 100% of the secret sauce? You just look at the number of projects that come up every year. Like I just look at the Cloud Native Foundation, the new projects that are coming up. To be able to leverage that is something which is, I think, is insanely useful. Before that, it's been a realm of the vendors and waiting for their roadmap. So for us, it's an enabler. How do we use it? How do we actually use it as the fastest as we can? That's a challenge.
And sort of the way we look at it is that it's not just about the software. So yes, the key to faster innovation is that collaborative process, but it's the whole process of everything in the entire life cycle, not just the software. It's the software, the hardware, the business process, the legal aspects, the marketing. All of these things are done in a collaborative way to actually drive things quicker. The question is, can we solve those business challenges faster with this technology? Because not everything has been open sourced yet. Right? If you love it, it had, but it's not. And from my perspective, it's what can we actually do? And I look at this technology. If I'm improving something, it doesn't hurt us to actually go look at what's already existing, because even in open source, right, a lot of times we'll have people trying to resolve the same problem with yet another community, right? And now we got 3 communities trying to solve the same problem, and maybe it's actually a better idea to actually put it onto one thing and then go do this. We see this in the community as well, that we kind of have a bunch of different ones, then we aggregate them together, and then we kind of go back out again. So this is an ongoing challenge, just like it's been in the standards bodies. When Daniel and I have been in IETF and all these other standards bodies for years, it's a similar kind of thing. Ian?
For me, I think it depends on the life cycle and the stage of the problem that you're trying to solve. In certain situations, it can actually take you much longer to generate consensus in an open source community. At the same time, you've got the great benefit of a diverse community of contributors from around the world, and you're not just really talking to the people around the cube with you to make a decision, so you can actually make a much better decision. I think there's also, I was talking to Cheryl about this just before we came up, there's situations where if you launch things in an open source way, you actually eliminate all the very long and drawn out discussions about who owns the IP. And you can actually start the innovation process with lower barriers and much more quickly. So I think that's a great place to accelerate it. Are there situations where I get frustrated with the decision making and how things go in open source? Absolutely. If I think back to my days as a proprietary developer, I could gather a few people together, make a decision in an hour, and move forward. Now I have to generate consensus. I don't control the environment. I get to shape the environment. And I think that's the big difference between proprietary and open source, and some of the benefits as well.
Thank you. So how does the use of open source software impact a company's competitive advantage? Is it the same for a startup or a large company, how they're impacted by using the software?
I'll go from my angle as a user of open source and not necessarily a complete developer of the open source. What happens in that case, it's the delivery aspect, the operationalization process becomes a way more impactful and a greater concern than being the first. Like the way you get to be the first on the track on the market using those kind of technologies will be less on the development cycle of the code or the platform, more on how you integrate it and make it production ready. We look at right now, discussed this morning about the 5G rollouts and all the implications it has. So when you start to use open source software, and you can look at this, everybody starts with at the same block in the run race, at the racetrack. It's actually how fast are you able to deliver and implement this in a sane and operationally ready manner. That's going to be the differentiator.
And the way I look at it is sort of, it's trying to get a solution to market that is modular and easy to evolve and expand, because we've already got existing technologies that people are using. And as I said before, if I go look at the stack and go give us a grade on how much of the stack is open source, I probably give it maybe a yellow. It's kind of like maybe 30% if we're lucky. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff that isn't there. So our customers have to think about, okay, where's the mature open source technologies I can take advantage of? But the other one is that in the absence of a mature open source technology and solution, I, as a business owner, have to take advantage of the existing technologies I have available to me that are proprietary and combine those two things together and integrate that to make it to market first, to own the market that I want to go be in. So this is that balancing act that we have to do to balance those two things together.
I think there's a range of approaches for open source depending on what stage of company you are. I think if you're an early stage startup, there's just such a rich ecosystem of open source projects out there that if you're not leveraging open source, I think I would argue that you're likely to be not successful in your startup. That's a fairly bold statement. If you're going to go full proprietary, I can guarantee there's going to be a chunk of open source in there, and you really need to look at how you're looking at your business model going forward and how you leverage that open source overall.
No, that's a good one, Ian, because I was with a small startup in Brazil, and I asked them kind of what they were doing, and they said, I'm doing IoT, and I said, so, what are you using? And he says, I'm doing all open source, and I said, so, you're using, Google's Kubernetes, and I said, what are you doing for support? I said, well, he says, I got a bit of support from somebody, but I'm not at the point yet where I need the full-blown support, of what I'm doing, and so he's getting enough support to do what he does at that point in time, but once he gets to the point of it becomes a risk, he needs to find an alternative to support what he's got. But he did start with pure open source and some Google, I'll call it, there's not really a 1-800 vanilla Kubernetes that I can go call tomorrow and get like 15-minute response time. Right. So you got to kind of deal with that.
Yeah, and I think for mid-stage companies, then you start looking at where are you investing your dollars, and if you're not getting support from a company like Wind River or Red Hat or somebody else, you're tying up a lot of your development velocity, maintaining lower levels of the stack versus investing in innovation that's relevant directly to your customers. So I think that's where it's different there. And then a larger company like Bell Canada starts shifting more into the user space, and there's some interesting ways that can go either from software as a service and other models as well. So I think it's very different at each stage of a company's life cycle.
Yeah, which brings up a good question, and is for companies, is it a business, technical, or cultural choice to use open source software?
I have to say it's a bit of both. It's a bit of business. To me, it's a bit of business and cultural. It's a great cultural shift from not even necessarily using open source code, but just going away from the oh, sorry, just don't want to name names, but I'm going to do it. So, oh, we need to use Oracle. Back then in the database world, it was that like Oracle, it's a safe bet. And our vendor A is another safe bet. And making that shift towards open source is kind of a cultural change. You're going to allow that some of those questions are not answered yet. Maybe even the support company you're going to buy from Red Hat or even Wind River don't have the answers. You have to go to the mailing list to understand those kind of problems. That's a big shift in cultural change from somebody who was able to say, I'll just beat the money problem to a vendor and he's going to solve it. On the business side, it actually enables you to do something completely different that you would normally have done, because now you're in a model where you can actually go in the community and influence some of the projects that you know you're going to get commercial support from afterwards, but you will be able, at least at that time, to inject some of your requirements and invest into those requirements, so that what the product you actually buy afterwards has the requirements you wanted, and not just do the roadmap and the commercial agreement discussion we normally did to do in a big RFP and wait for somebody to give those answers.
Right.
So, being that Red Hat is really pretty much, the open source way is the way we do things, we look at it as a complete cultural shift for the entire business. That's how we look at it, and it's about collaboration, meritocracy, and giving people change, control, and freedom to do the things that they want to go do. And that's really kind of the key thing that we look at, and it's really changing the way that we approach things as well, because now you have kind of a different way to look at things. And so that's how we kind of see it, and the business leaders have to kind of think about this. And one of the things we get into right now is that in that cultural change and business processes that exist today, many of our customers have very, I'll call it physical kind of organizations that aren't easy to kind of change. And that's kind of the big thing that's going on. And some of them attempt to go change the way they do things by reorganizing, to try and, fix this problem. But in reality, what they need to do is go find a team of people across many things, find some partners alongside of that, put these people together, let them go do some work, and then once they actually get some useful work done, then actually organize to do that work, right? Rather than trying to restructure before they actually try and solve a real problem.
I think it's all three. Let me start with the business. When you sell, or if you go back to the early days of open source was thought of as free. And it clearly isn't, and now we're sort of in the stage where there's a clearly recognized business model around services and support. When I was preparing for the talk, I actually came across a very good presentation by Mark Levine from Andreessen Horowitz, one of the big VCs in Silicon Valley. He actually wrote a good article 5 years ago that said there will never be another Red Hat, and really gave a lot of kudos to Red Hat's success in the market. But now he's talking about, okay, what's the next stage of open source, and really shifting to new business models in addition to services and support, but also around software as a service and other ways to help customers operationalize their software. So I think we're on an ongoing journey. We've come a long way from open source 1.0, and I think really recognizing the power of open source to transform businesses as well as technology. So on the technology side, as I said, I was part of launching a new open source project about 18 months ago, and myself and my team had to go through a complete change in every way we did our development processes. We had to adopt new tools from the open source community we were part of. We shifted to an 100% upstream first development model. So our developers who were used to developing code on their own, in their own environment didn't have to get code reviews from anybody in the community. They just did their own thing. Now they're writing code. As they're submitting it, they're doing code reviews with a community of developers around the world. All the posts on the mailing list are very dynamic and really good dialogues between people that you may have never met. So it's a really different way of doing development, which leads me to the sort of third phase, which is really cultural. And certainly for our organization as developers, we've really had to shift to an environment where you had a high degree of control to one where you can really shape your environment. You don't have 100% control. And for those of us with control issues, that becomes a big challenge, right? So, you know, you're trying to develop and deliver content to customers in a predictable way, but you're operating in an environment that you don't control the content, you don't control the timeline, but yet you still got business objectives that you've got to meet. And then the last sort of piece, Ian touched on it a little bit, is, you know, the business and the culture and how you operate your company. I think Red Hat's a great leader in that way in terms of an open culture. You know, Wind River has pieces of the organization that are still operating in a proprietary way, whereas my part of the business are operating in a pure open source, 100% upstream way. And, you know, that creates a bit of a dynamic tension in terms of how we operate our business and our culture internally as well. So stay tuned for more there. There's definitely some more challenges to address, and certainly ones that are very, very interesting as well.
Yeah, I'd add to that last statement is that the day you start going more to the open communities and the open source model, it's the relationship you had, like knowing that you now have to pass time in weekly meetings, mailing lists, Slack channels, IRC to figure out what's going on. This is why I think it's a big cultural choice and a big business decision as well, because you need to accept that some of your resources will now not necessarily be 100% developing something internally or getting value directly. They need to be part of that community ecosystem so that they can actually navigate through this. And sometimes I call it a soap opera of open communities, because everybody tries to have their open community, and you need to figure out across that industry how the players, how they want to work, like the OpenStack group compared to the CNCF group, and they figure out all those angles across the vendors ecosystem, which everyone has their own agendas, and it takes a long time to figure out, and I still don't master it, how to play around those ecosystems that you get something. So you need to allow for that in a company. So it's a big shift. Like people are thinking about monetizing every minute you work on something. Like remember the LinkedIn guys talk about the IT as a development efficiency. It's there to help you develop faster. Well, you need to agree that almost probably in the open community, sometimes 15 to 20% of the time is going to be how to navigate that soap opera of communities.
Definitely, and that's you know, much as Red Hat's involved in so many communities and so many things that we do, and we actually help build the governance model for them and those kinds of things. But even at that, we still have to kind of pick where we're going to go spend our time, that is important to our customers, and that's really kind of an ongoing challenge as it is for them. And this is again that collaborative. Okay, let's go work together on this. We're going to leave that one aside for a moment and just kind of trying to build that mature community of interest. It is a constant challenge, but it does get to that. Solution faster in my mind, and lets us make decisions, and that fail fast kind of thing can happen earlier in this environment.
And I think one last comment I'd add to what Danielle and Ian said is really that it opens up new opportunities to collaborate with your customers in almost real time as well. And I think that's a really powerful way to speed innovation. Back to the first question we talked about, building the culture and being able to collaborate with people that you wouldn't necessarily normally be able to collaborate as early in the development process as you can in open source.
So should companies have policies around the use of open source software and the support of it? Like, is there best practice that companies should take?
The ones I would say, because we can go, as I said before the panel, we can go in this for the rest of the afternoon, but the tricks we learned is there's a lot about there's a legal side to it as you go into the open source communities, which license models you're going to agree with. Some vendors, some companies have decided. I can actually not answer fully for all what Bell does, because actually that's legal, that decides what kind of those licensings we agreed upon. Then there's a question about when we're all so secretive or important about our branding and how do we deal with the use of the open source community? When do we upstream everything we want to do? How do we leverage that kind of ecosystem? How do we differentiate ourselves the same way? Do we keep the IP internal? But we want to. It's really something which is a challenge to deal with, and it's a case by case. You might start by fully open, then decide I need to close. It's really something we need to deal with. But the licensing part of it, which kind of licenses you agree with, open source license you agree with, is kind of the first one that comes to mind.
No, that's a great point, Daniel. And most of our customers have kind of varying policies on kind of what they're going to do with open source. And it's really about, how do they get support for the open source bits they choose to actually use, right? Because one of the main things that I would say the majority of our customers have to think through is once they decided to use open source, and whatever licensing they've decided to go do, we get this question all the time. So why do people actually, spend time with Red Hat? Well, because they don't want the risk, right, to their business, by not having somebody backing up what they're actually deploying, right, in production, to meet their SLA. Now, one of the challenges when it comes to the SLAs that we're seeing, especially in the telco space, is that our customers, not all of them, but some of them, are basically still trying to tie the SLA for the end-to-end service across the entire solution set, right? And that then forces, the vendor that's saying, well, if you want to do that, you got to buy everything from me, right? It's not a collaborative SLA, right? And some of our other customers, they do have a collaborative SLA, and they kind of say, okay, you're the leader from the partners that I'm working with, but you need to work together with this collective set of partners to actually go build this service end to end. And they're the ones that are actually moving faster in this space because they're not, kind of locking the vendor into, you've got to meet this SLA for the entire thing. So that's the other challenge to the choices by which they use open source and how they put a legal arrangement with whoever's providing that support to them.
I think one area where I've seen some recent positive changes is how sourcing organizations are actually approaching open source and starting to recognize a little bit more that it's beyond services and support, but it's also IP and IP risk, choosing the licenses, reviewing all the licenses in a very complex ecosystem of open source projects that somebody might be consuming. Typically a specific project will have one open source license that they're using, but they all come with different terms, and you need a very competent legal department to work through that, and then processes to be able to adopt all these new projects very quickly and seamlessly. And so in our organization, we actually have an IP group that is always working with the development team to make sure that the developers are aware of the licenses that they're starting to be consuming and how that impacts and evolves the business implications as well. And yeah, SLAs, when you're talking about an ecosystem of open source projects, wow, I wish I had an answer for that. Maybe that's one of those innovative problems that Amy was talking about that we should go off and solve. But I think that's those are some of the areas in terms of policy in a business that goes beyond the technical department. There's typically in a development organization more awareness of open source. So I think having a policy framework across an organization will just help your open source journey tremendously.
And I also do find that some of our, again, it's a matter of what kind of tooling you put into your system. So there's ways to actually track the versions, the vulnerabilities, the registry of the software that you've got. And some of our customers are very good at this. They got thousands and thousands of nodes of software, and they can actually keep very good track of what they're using, why they're using it, where they're using it, and other customers don't have this, right? So this allows some other customers to get into a lot more trouble by not knowing what they've actually got in the system, right? So it's a lot easier to go resolve that if you've got an automated system to keep track of this thing. And some of our larger customers, if they didn't do this, they could take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks to actually upgrade all the nodes in their system, right, to solve whatever patching security issue they found somewhere in some server, right, to keep them consistent. So we provide those kinds of tools, but not everybody uses them. Right? It's one of those things.
Yeah, I'd add two things to this. One is on the security side, is as we go along, as we evolve the software cycles to be less contained monolithic into virtual machines or kind of closed systems, you go more cloud native. Well, the sanity of code is something you need to think about. So how to actually validate that the code is risk-free or at least less risk-prone. So this is some angle that you realize that when you start looking at open source communities and you scan those codes, you realize, oh my God, would I actually put my packet core on this? There's a challenge that you need to figure out. The second thing is also you'll have to look at is when you go in upstream and you open source, it's really cool to think, hey, I go on GitHub, I fork a project, I code something, it's new, I breaded it, I'm gonna go in production. There's part about the maintainers in a public program that you need to think about. How much do you guarantee that your code is gonna live through kernel updates, dependency updates? It's one thing to put something out there. It's another thing to keep it running for the next 2-3 years and make sure that it evolves with all the software patches and the evolution of all the underlying dependencies. And that's something you need to think about when you think about, I'm going to invest into open source software.
Are there choices out there to help you support the software?
There are tools. So as I said, for getting the software to go to the lifecycle, I think going from investing into either the staff to make them, because you want to make this your bread and butter as a value add, like something you actually generate. That's one way. The other way is you go into the upstream community to make sure that your requirements are there, but then you look at partners like those two gentlemen to figure out a way to make it commercially soundable, and then the life cycle comes in. And on the security side, there's a myriad of ways of looking at this and tools that are available either in the open or in the commercials, but you need to think about those things.
Yeah, I think the long-term maintenance is a huge issue. You know, the typical open source project will provide some level of support or maintenance, but it really won't support a business on a multi-year journey of having something run 24/7 in a high reliability environment. So, you know, I think that that's a great point in terms of, you know, how do you keep up to date? How do you make sure that your business is secure long term?
There's a kind of an analogy we say is like, everybody talked about open source and open networking and all those technologies. So, those 5 guys in the basement that are coding this, and it's pretty cool, neat things. Everybody laugh because they say all the big companies, like the big incumbent vendors, have an insane amount of developers. And we really look down deeper, you might end up that same big vendor has only 5 guys developing. But the trick is he's commercially bound to that software, so he's going to stick to it. The 5 guys in their basement who talked about a cool project, there's no commercial reason why they need to keep going this. They might get hired somewhere else.
They'll move on to the next application development hackathon and go do the next cool thing. And that's the other thing that's also a challenge for anybody in this industry is that it's keeping the talent pool that you've got, right, interested in working on the thing that your business wants to go do. Because if you're not keeping them, kind of happy doing what they're doing, they'll, I've seen, entire teams that were working on X at, customer Y, and that team left and went to some other player, right? And now this team that had invested, they've got to go rebuild that team, and it's a huge shift to the business when that type of thing happens.
Cool. So intellectual property is something very dear to my heart. So I'm just curious how companies can protect their IP if they use a lot of open source software in their products.
I will let them.
I'll take a stab at that one. So I think the thing that companies need to think about in terms of, what is the thing that is most important to protect as a business to go run that thing? And it's actually the business policy by which you run your business. That's the piece you want to keep kind of to yourself. Right? And people typically don't patent that stuff. And so the other things that are kind of easily shareable amongst the industry that are not at that level, that's kind of where you kind of do that sort of open it up as much as you can and have that ability to have open interoperable interfaces between these piece parts and not try and protect every little piece of technology that happens to be in the stack. Right? It's really about making sure that you're protecting your business acumen knowledge more so than the technology that's running underneath it. That's just kind of a view of where I would spend my effort in protecting something.
Right.
Yeah, I need to agree with Ian even more.
I know. But we could actually give ourselves an example on this one, right? So we were talking about it at the lunch table with Chris. We're talking about ONAP. Right? And so ONAP is a very large open source project, many, many modules. But there's actually a predecessor to that project from AT&T called eComp. Right? That's the one that AT&T actually uses. That's the whole thing. Right? But the piece that they did not open source is what I just spoke about, the business policy piece that sits on top. Right? That's the piece they did not open source. That's the piece they kept to themselves. And that's the thing that they believe is how they differentiate, how they deliver services from a business perspective. right? So this is kind of the balancing act that companies have to go look at as to what is their business and what is their policy about how they make money, right? The technology underneath all of that, they can share that, evenly.
Another good example is ORAN. So there's a community recently started up to focus in on 5G RAN, radio access network. It's a very dynamic project. Nokia, AT&T, you name it in the telecom industry, there is a player in that community. The interesting part is that there's a standards, more proprietary focus space within that community, but then there's also a pure play open source component as well. And some of the radio vendors are actually being able to participate in this community somewhat how Ian was describing, and keeping a chunk of their IP protected as well, while collaborating in an open source way. So the word is still out on it. We'll see how successful it is long term, but people are trying to do that to get some of the advantages of open source, but also protect their IP and collaborate with their competitors as well. So, I think it's a very important area. But my personal view is, are you trying to protect your code, or are you trying to protect how you think about solving your customers' problems, and how you accelerate their business, and how do you bring value? I think that's the focus for IP, and that's the way I think about IP in the open source space.
Yeah, so I see two angles to it. From the ONAP perspective, we do it. So we use the upstream code of ONAP, but we modified it. We don't upstream the code we did proprietary, because this is our own IP, because it's aligned with our business logic and our business services. You might have other cases where we actually fully upstream the code and make it, we forgo that IP notion, but it's a conscious thought that you do it because you want to foster the ecosystem to follow that path. Those are some investments we do as well. We do those in both trends. Like sometimes you want to have like a technology or a solution to be more available to a broader community. So you make the knowledgeable choice of upstreaming it so that you actually open that ecosystem and get broader participation into it. And for other reasons, you will decide, in the case of the ONAP, that some of it will remain proprietary, because this is where it's becoming our business logic.
Yeah. And I think it actually would have been fun to have a hardware vendor on the panel, right? Because then it's a different conversation as to
definitely.
what they'd like to protect versus what they'd like to open up.
Yeah.
And they, as Daniel says, they're making conscious choices as well. But it all comes down to any company that's trying to do something. They invest in research, to do things based on a return on that investment, right? And as long as that's a win-win solution for them, they will move in the direction that the world is headed, right? And so as that's still in, there's still always tension in that picture, right? That's what's going to go on, right?
So we're going to be taking questions in a few minutes. If you want to think about questions you would like to ask before, but I'm going to ask one last question. How does the use of open source impact the cost of a product to the end user, and in fact to the whole supply chain? Does it reduce cost, or you would think so, but
it depends. It really depends. One thing I realized over time is the reason why I'm in cloud native, and I'm also talking about P4, is now I got open source in hardware, I've got open source with cloud, and I'm able to look at the ways of making things happening. So to me, I would say I'm benefiting right now in the case that I have angles where normally I was the dreaded cost per bit problem. Like we now have a full plane of glass of where actually how to make it happen. At lunch, we had a discussion that through that kind of disaggregation of both hardware, software, and even going to cloud, I have those kind of capabilities now. The trick is always going to be afterwards, you need commercial agreement on this, because I was referring to my guy in the NOC at 2 o'clock in the Saturday morning. If there's a problem, is he going to go on a mailing list or Slack channel to get troubleshooting, or he would like to have support? But being able to go into that disaggregation mode, I now have a broader capability of picking and choosing what partners I want to work with.
And so there's sort of two angles to this in what depends. And so we've had lots of studies with analysts. IDC was up this morning talking about some of the things they do. ACG does some research on, what's the benefit of using these technologies to, optimize the costs. but it's really, in most cases, it's optimizing the time to revenue for whoever's building whatever they're building. So that solves the problem for whoever's building either the product or the service that's coming out. That doesn't get to the end user. But what it does provide is the ability to, if we can accelerate this, there's new players come in to the system. Now we create more competition. That eventually brings more choice and freedom to the end user.
Right.
And we expect, over a longer period of time, an actual cost benefit to those end users, getting a greater collection of services at a whatever cost structure you want to go, at a lower cost for that set of services. Right? So that's the balancing act that's going on.
And just before, I know you're going to have one thing I want to add is sometimes it's not because you're not doing it because you want to actually get a commercial product out of it. It's to force that industry shift so that even the incumbent vendors you're going to buy from are going to have that same mentality shift to go in that kind of same product. You're going to buy a complete product, but you know that because of that strength of going to the upstream and the open source model and look at the ways of disaggregating software and the platforms, the ecosystem overall is changing to your benefit, even though you're going to make a business decision to go with a complete package of a vendor. Because in his process, he's also joining in that kind of ecosystem transformation. So his solution is now less monolithic and he's using the same kind of capability.
Yeah, if I think back to the early part of my career when telecom vendors were doing fully vertically integrated solutions, not only would they build the hardware, but they'd build the compiler, the operating system, everything, right? Today, you can get an operating system from one company, you can get an open source hardware platform, you can get a cloud virtualization layer from another company, and a whole set of applications from a very wide ecosystem. So that provides a lot of competitive pressure. I'm sure Bell and other operators use that quite effectively. But at the same time, it gives you access to a huge breadth of innovation. So I think you got to look at the cost, but also, how do you want to grow your business? How do you want to innovate and bring more value to your customers? I switch to a more current example, Shopify is a great software as a service company, but all their software is built on open source. They're huge contributors to Ruby and Ruby on Rails and other projects. They're very active in CNCF and other areas, so they see the value of open source, and I'm sure they're partnered with various people in terms of where they're getting commercial support for part of their stack, but also innovating and contributing to projects that help them accelerate their revenue growth and their growth as a business as well. So, I think cost is only one part of the picture in my mind, and it's what's the economic value that open source can bring to the table, and I think that's a tremendous multiplying factor that we have with open source.
And I've come from most of my career before Red Hat. I've only been at Red Hat for 4 years, is building these proprietary platforms for most of my career, with the Ciscos of the world and others over time. And I see an opportunity to kind of speed the way we do things, but we still have to be pragmatic in the realities of what we've decided to go do to try and change what has been very efficient in hardware, and it was very software driven, but not open. Right? So now we want to actually take every piece and open it up, and Daniel's already working with open hardware pieces that are functional for him, but we want to be able to actually take the hardware that's underneath and pick and choose that I'm going to use an Intel chip for this, an ARM chip for that, an NVIDIA GPU for this, and be able to actually drive that infrastructure from a software perspective. Right? And that's what I'm very excited about, is to see us get to that kind of a world where these things move a whole lot quicker. And as Daniel said as well, the vendors who are joining us in this vision, right, are actually benefiting it from it as well. Right? It's kind of the balancing act that they're going through.
Good. Any questions from the audience? I think there's a microphone.
Just a couple of comments. First off, I'm not sure if everybody is aware, but the federal government has a open source first policy. And I know that a lot of the departments are struggling to figure out what that really means, but it's a big change, and that was only introduced, I think, within the past year. Secondly, a comment, I'm not a contributor in terms of open source, but I do help out in particular with the people who are involved in developing the network stack within the Linux kernel. The concern from the development community is that, and in particular in Linux, is that the whole process is becoming way too commercialized. That there's so much commercial interest now in open source that it's almost perverting the original idea behind open source. So now the developers are seeing that companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook are making billions of dollars basically on the backs of people who are contributing their innovation to the kernel and getting no compensation. And the fact that these developers, right, are seeing that, hey, what's the point of me contributing when in fact all these parasites basically are getting all the advantage and contributing almost nothing back to the community itself. So, oh, thank you. Anyway, and I kind of know this because one of the founders of the NetDev Society was created because the feeling was that things like the Linux Foundation, again, are commercial interests, and they drive commercial view, not the view of the community. So the NetDev Society was created to support the people working in NetDev so that they had a community way of getting together. And like I say, there's almost like no support from the big players in terms of actually helping the people who really drive the innovation within the kernel.
Very good question.
Maybe I'll start. I guess I think the crux of your question is how do you make open source sustainable in a competitive ecosystem? I think one of the key ways is strong governance and being able to have an open governance model. Early in the life cycle of Starling X, we spent a lot of time thinking very deliberately about the governance model, as well as how to elect people from the community to leadership positions, and doing that in a very open way. I think the other side of your question is, how do you get more and more users to contribute back to the various projects that you're consuming? I think that's a growing realization of, how do you maintain a healthy open source ecosystem? That's why paying for support and maintenance helps fund future innovation in open source projects. And, I think bringing that story and that value discussion back to the users and consumers of open source and why they should contribute is critically important. I can't really comment on why large global enterprises don't contribute, but maybe others have opinions.
To your comment is that when we look at open source communities, we're not targeting only Linux Foundation. NetDev is part of one. FOSDEM, that ecosystem that goes there as well, is there. We look at all those things. So some of the innovations we see from big vendors like Mellanox sometimes, you see them most permanently in NetDev than you would see them somewhere else. So you have to think about this. When I talk about the soap opera of Linux and open source communities, that's part of this. We know from, I will not say it's a fail, but for us, the OpenAV project was for us as overall kind of a big failure because it showed like piranhas going and trying to find a way to go into open source community and get something out of it. So we backed out pretty fast of being so involved into it because of that. And we look at all open source communities, we look at those kind of trends and how they work to figure out how it goes. Personally, I like more academia style communities because the kind of research that come out of it are less about commercial initiatives, but you need to look at those other aspects if you want to do a broad community. I will not get telcos to agree on a design and on an ecosystem in NetDev. They will not be there, but they will be in Linux Foundation for telco and embedded Linux and things like this. So you need to balance this act.
And definitely when I go look at how Red Hat participates is we're very much involved in the governance of many of these communities, and we choose which ones to participate in. And the key thing is that, there's only so many things that we actually attempt to build mature productized solutions from. Meanwhile, we have our academic contributors in many, many projects that we don't actually have a product in, right? Because we were talking earlier about own app. Red Hat does not have an own app, right? A commercial version of that, right? Other things we don't have, we don't actually, but we still want to be involved to make sure that the community is mature and that we can actually learn together and get value out of that contribution. Now, to your question about how do you actually, I'll call it, if you will, compensate the people who do contribute, I think that's that becomes a personal decision as to why they're doing what they're doing, right? We all do things because we love what we do, right? So the compensation model is one of those things you kind of have to think through. And you called it the soap opera, and we have significant challenges when we have very large organizations who are the major contributor to a community, and getting them to change their mind to go do things that they don't actually think they need, right? That's another part of the soap opera.
Right. Okay, we have time for one more question.
Hi. So the one thing about open source is that it's hard, right? And if you're running a small company and you want this Linux guru to join your company and do open source for you, you're going to find it very hard to even hire people who understand the concepts. And if you're going to ask your, say, 50-plus-year-old DBA to switch from, say, Oracle to MariaDB because it's open source, he's just going to look at you and say no. So what is needed there to kind of make open source more accessible? Because it seems as if it's only for the programmers who are like the 20-somethings who understand all the latest technologies to even play in that space. And how do we make it more inclusive for people who might not be that technically smart?
Maybe I'll go from a telco who's trying to make that transformation. It's a culture shift, as I said before. First, you have developers that come like your database admin that was in his small island is like, he's only doing this. Some of our guys we've worked with are developers, and they start to see the community and be able to be engaged with other people, so they don't have to look at the problem only by their eyes. Having other groups, participate in this is something which is really interesting. The second thing is the recognition. A lot of the people that we hired that came from the open community or our internal that went to the open community, the community recognition about the kudos about your code, that kind of involvement is really something that they thrive on, and they really like that. If you go to developer forums, we have internal developer days because of creating that foster ecosystem, even internally, how to make our own development cycle be more open within internally, because even big companies have their own siloed teams that want to do their things by themselves. You don't even need to go upstream and into the open to figure out that almost all companies have units that they don't want to talk to each other. So that kind of open ecosystem of how to collaborate is one thing. The challenge is that if we discuss this, there's maybe I would say there's actually an open community conference and developer forum every week worldwide. And if you want your employees to participate in this, the challenge is how do you make them be able to go and we can do Slack, we can do IRC, we can do GitHub. The human contact becomes really important. This is the guy you had a drink with, a coffee with, or you draw into a conference or a meeting that afterwards sticks with you, and you make those human relations. We're going in a digital age, and you realize that for those communities to work, it's the human part that actually makes it work. So, and how do you make a company say, well, I'm now going to invest in travel because I need those guys to meet with each other. And that's a challenge because it's preclusive. A lot of people, we don't allow for that much travel. And if you want to have 100 developers and they need to be across 100 conferences to talk to each other, it's an investment. But in the end, the recognition they get and the drive that they will, I should not be saying this, but they will do 2 hours of code at night and they will publish because they like it and they get that realization, and they will answer Slack channel at 9 p.m. while they're watching Game of Thrones because they like that ecosystem, is something you cannot create without opening it up.
Right. And it's and the other thing is it's also not just about the code, right? Because it's about the collaboration and that connection. But a lot of our customers, they don't actually contribute any code at all, right? What they do contribute, very important, is what is the requirement that they need to help solve the problem, right? That's an idea. That's not the code itself, right? That's a whole part of the process, right? That's kind of the thing that's there. And the other thing that we spend a lot of time, is taking, we call them little sprints, innovation labs with our customers to go take a team that is being permitted to go work in this way, to go solve some problem and work with some coders, some consultants, some security people, some partners to go do something. And that starts to build that, and then you can replicate that and expand that over time. And we go from maybe 10 people working on something, and we're now in some of our customers, they've got 600 people that are now kind of living in this world. But it's taken them a couple of years to get there. Right? These are the kinds of things that all companies have to kind of think of. Where do they invest their time and resources to go accelerate their business?
I just have a quick last comment. I described the journey myself and my team have been on over the last 2 years. I'd say the last 2 years working in open source have been probably the most rewarding for me as a person, and in terms of growth opportunities, exposure, reward, and recognition, it's just been fantastic. People who I thought would be really resistant have actually been hugely effective in open source communities, surprised me. So I would really encourage you to think broadly about what opportunities you open up with your developers by encouraging them to participate in open source. And I would expect you'd be surprised, and Daniel's absolutely right. It's all about culture and helping people through a change journey, and I think that's critically important.
So we have one quick question.
Is there any research on how much the average software company uses open source, and how much of it is developed in-house, and how much percentage-wise do they profit off of it?
There's actually a fairly lengthy report that I sent to Natalie before this event. Red Hat did an enterprise use of open source, and it's got a pretty good set of data points that kind of looks at it different angles in different industries that talks about the percentage. But it does vary company to company, but it's a growing percentage of almost every industry that is taking advantage of open source in different applications within their business, whether it's security, web servers, all these different pieces. So I couldn't give you one flat number, but that report's quite useful to go take a look at it from an overall industry by vertical perspective.
And the percentages I showed at the beginning came from that report.
The report I mentioned from Andreessen Horowitz earlier, Mark Lunin, one line I liked out of that article was, a lot of people have been talking about how software is eating the world. Well, he said software is eating the world and open source is eating software.
Exactly.
There's the answer.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much. We got one more.
Yeah.
Okay, really short.
It's going to be a short one. Hi, my name is Ernest, and I just wanted to say that open source is good, but then along with it, it brings the question of trust. And when it comes to trust, and if any company tries to get the open source product and would want to sell it to the consumers, who takes the responsibility of this trust? Like, is it the company who gets this thing off the open source, or is it just in the air, and it's the consumer to be?
Yeah. So in terms of who actually supports that software that you've gotten, so if that open source software is pure community and it's not supported by anybody in particular, let's say that it's a community that Red Hat doesn't have a product for, right? Just pick one and whatever that is. Then what you would need to do is, and there's lots of people that do this around the planet, you would go find yourself a local systems integrator to actually be your support channel on behalf of that piece of open source code. Right? That's how you would get your support for that code, that they would look after you and deliver that to you. Now, if it is one in the Red Hat family or the Wind River family, then you would get the support from them. And this is the way that Red Hat supports our bits, the other people support their bits, and if it's a pure community play, then you got to go find a third party, a non-software company, to go do that. And typically you've got local integrators that do this in, whether it's in Argentina, whether it's here in Canada. I've seen them all over the world that provide that kind of support to open source software.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to this panel, Natalie, for moderating, Daniel, Ian, and Ian. What a great topic that I'm sure we'll be dealing with more in the future. So let's thank our panel.